that's the hardest part about grief work is it's never one thing. It's never a worksheet or a book and then you move on. It is every single step forward is a Pandora's box of the different areas you can explore. And that's why I think it's so crucial that we have conversations about it because like I still stand on it. We all have grief. We could be grieving or actively pursuing learning something from. I just also know that sucks a lot. It's really hard to do. And um, I really think being able to introduce the concept of tragic optimism, this idea that I can both and through life. There will be both wonderful things and hard things, and I am a healthier, happier, more whole person on the other side of it.
I'd like to welcome to the show Mandy Capehart.
Hi, how are you?
How you doing today?
I am so good.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I wanted to start just by asking you, well, two things that I know that I do want to talk about is your experience and work with care deserts.
Yeah.
But I did want to start because the name of your book is Restorative Grief. And I wanted to ask you what restorative grief is, not just in the sense of it's the title of your book, but what is restorative grief?
Yeah. Thank you for asking. And thank you for having me. I'm always open and happy to talk about loss and why it matters. I started my whole journey around grief work when I was little. I've lost someone practically every year, whether it's through divorce or moving or death. And as a young person, the framework I had was things are going to be okay because I'm a child, right? And that's the best my parents and caregivers can do for me at that time. But what it taught me holistically, and I didn't put it together until I was much older, was there are positive things on the horizon. There are also harmful, heavy things. And yet, I can still move into a future that means something to me. There is still an opportunity for restoration. And so when my mom died in 2016, it was on the heels of losing my maternal grandfather who had helped raise us, and my great grandmother, who I knew long into my years right before that, among some friends as well. And I just recognized this is an opportunity to start investigating what restoration actually looks and feels like. There was about a week after my mom died that I let myself lament and I let myself fall apart. And then I just said, all right, either I'm 100% in on what all of this looks like and all of the nuance and all of the pain, or I'm going to just check out for the rest of life because losing my mom was unexpected and unfair. It wasn't until 2020, just like everyone else's life pivoted, I was surviving a miscarriage in January. I was dealing with having just lost my job and a horrible former boss mistreating and abusing me in the workplace and even after I left. And then I heard about COVID and thought, no, this is my year to deal and grieve. Why is everyone else jumping on board? But the reality was, as I understood the seriousness of it, I didn't want to live in a world where untended grief was going to be generational and permanent, basically, with everyone and everywhere we went. So I started writing down my story about grief work and just the ways that I interpreted what it looks like to move forward with loss as a companion, as a familiar, as an awareness, just a holistic awareness of this is part of the human experience. And all of that requires us to look at ourselves as whole people, heart, mind, body, and spirit. So the book itself and even the practice and the podcast, everything that came with it, the phrase restorative grief stuck with me since day one. So that combined with my desire to create grief literacy and attend to communities where there are no resources, whether it's face-to-face support, whether it's grief literate therapists in and of themselves, because those are honestly vastly they're not easy to access. They're not available. A lot of therapists have no idea how to deal with grief.
Do you think, now you had, this is just a little bit of a digression, but you had your first child like in the same time frame that your mom died in 2016? Yes,
yeah,
you had.
My daughter was born in 2014, but yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel that any of your work and moving forward and trying to sort really your history of loss out? Because you mentioned you didn't want it to become a generational thing, which I think is so important. You think your daughter inspired any of that for you?
A lot of the time, I thought about my daughter and the way she was being ripped off by losing a grandmother. My mom moved across the state into a small duplex to help me care for my daughter when I returned to work because I couldn't find childcare. And to me, that was one of the most selfless acts. Who does that? Who gives up their entire life and their state where they are in their job to care for family? My mom did. And when we found out she was sick, all I could grieve was this anticipation of what my daughter would not get to experience with my mom. Because she and I, even as young, when I was young, my mom and I would talk about someday we're going to take my kids, mom, and then we're going to go here and we're going to do this and we're going to have this experience. And all of that was gone. And so part of that is absolutely inspired by knowing my daughter's going to be in a house where I'm grieving, where my husband's grieving the loss of his mother-in-law, because they had a great relationship. And my daughter has to learn how to hold space for herself. And she's going to be raised among people whose parents have no idea. She was in kindergarten in 2020. So COVID disrupted her early education. You can see it playing out in the kids now whose parents were able to create space and support them well and whose weren't. And so I want her to be as emotionally intelligent as possible and at an age appropriate level as well. But there are definitely moments where it's come in helpful for her to understand. I'm like, they're grieving. That's why they're lashing out, sweetheart. This is not about you. And giving her space to explore, well, what does it look like when I'm grieving? Oh, yeah, I've lashed out as well. And right. And creating space to become a better parent, which is always the goal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, you talk about in your book unmasking anger. So I'm guessing the lashing out and the unmasking anger is was hard to deal with in your loss and the losses around you.
Yeah. Yeah. Unmasking anger was something that was really challenging simply because I pretended I wasn't angry for a very long time.
Mm.
I would sit back and say, like, I'm not angry. I'm fine. And some of it was the suppression of, yes, I'm fine. Don't let me disrupt you. Don't make think I'm a problem. And the other part of it I realized later was, oh, I move through anger very quickly. I can experience a burst of anger or even rage and very quickly recognize what's beneath it. Anger is a secondary emotion. And so for us as grievers to learn how to unmask it and see it for what it is, as a protector, as a response to injustice, as a real and human response to being harmed, marginalized, dismissed, disrespected. We get angry because we know, wow, we should really be treated better. We deserve to be treated like humans, to have our dignity preserved. And when that doesn't happen, well, of course we would be angry about it, but our culture doesn't allow for that. And I was just thinking this morning too, man, my life as a woman makes it really hard for me to be assertive and express anger without being labeled as erratic or harmful or untrustworthy. So even these little parts of my identity that I'm finding and uncovering as I'm doing this work around grief and with anger, it's such a fascinating space to explore. It's never just I lost my mom and now I'm sad. It's I lost my mom and quite literally everything has changed.
Mhm. Yeah, in the world of loss and grief, what they never tell you, and you don't really find out until you're in the club, is secondary losses
Yep.
are a big part of losing someone or losing a relationship or losing a job. I mean, there's always other stuff that goes with it, but when someone close to you dies, that's I think the worst part because
Yeah.
um I'm guessing, did you have family support? The reason I'm just asking because, as I said, a lot of your work and a lot of the stuff you've spoken about in other interviews that what I want to get to is care deserts. So you're not really aware of that if your family's really there. However, it seems for most people, their family is not fully there.
Yeah.
How did your family function for you when everything, especially when your mom died, but you did say you had had a few losses up
Losses,
until that.
yeah. We live in an area that we don't have any immediate family. We have, I think our closest family is 4.5 hours away or so.
Mm.
And even then, the access, the capacity in that close family is low. Capacity is low. The willingness to dive into grief literacy and grief education is something that I consistently say, hey, you may want to read and learn about this before you are actively grieving. Because it's the same thing. We don't go into a calculus classroom thinking, I've never learned algebra, I'll be fine. No, we usually have some precursors building up to the big event, right? So having an awareness is important. Having a lack of family support is something that becomes significantly and painfully obvious when a new grief event is happening. And part of it is trying to be really careful with myself and holding my own space. I'm not an expert on someone else's grief experience. I'm an educator and I'm a space holder and I am a guide and a coach, but your grief experience, even if we've lost the same person, we've lost someone different to us. And my sister's a great example. She lives a state away and we talk about this often. Hey, we lost a different person. My relationship to mom was different than yours. My parents were separated, but my dad lost my mom the same. And so it's really, really beautiful to actually be able to articulate that inside of my family dynamics. My mom's sister, my grandmother, they're all still with us and we all are grieving completely differently. And to be able to say, you don't have to understand what I'm going through to hold space for me. You don't have to get it. And we don't have to quiet each other when your experience of loss is different than mine. Again, we're grieving different people and our access to mom, even in her days of dying, were different. And that changes how we are grieving on this other side. Like you said, all those secondary losses, they get loud and we don't all have the same secondary losses after a person or a life event has shifted us significantly. So when it comes to those care deserts, especially when we don't have a support system around us, family and but specifically friends and people that can come alongside and help us with things, it's incredibly layered with the pain that you experience. That's something we were very fortunate to have was friends and very, very, very honest people that I could say, everything sucks and I'm dying and I want everything to burn. Would you mind coming and helping me fold laundry? And they would say yes, without fear of I'm going to ruin their day by being heavy and, whatever assumption people make about grievers and why they're so scary. But
Well, I mean, I would assume that you had some of the experiences that many people have that I've had, where you have people who either dismiss the state you're in, the pain you're feeling, or they try to talk you out of it in some way.
yes, yeah, that level of discomfort that non-grievers, and I use that so loosely because everyone's grieving something, but when people are not in active grief experiences and then they try to be
You know what,
helpful.
Mandy? I'm going to interrupt you and disagree with you.
Oh, go for it.
There are people out there, and I discovered this. I'm looking at my family and also my friends. There are a lot of people out there who get pretty far into life before anything ever happens to them.
Oh,
I
it's
mean,
true.
people's in
Yeah.
their 40s and 50s who really haven't had a loss, who, I mean,
Yeah.
they have no vocabulary for it. They have no understanding of it. And the thing that I take a little bit of a dark, cynical kind of comfort in it. A long time ago, this is like going back 25 years, I studied shiatsu. And I remember the teacher at the school. I went to this place called the Ohashi Institute in the city. And he said that people who never get sick often die very quickly because they're sort of out of touch with their health. They don't know when they're not feeling right, or like, like I feel this way and I should rest, or I should go to the doctor and this and that. So those people can go through life and then they just drop dead one day.
Interesting.
And I think about that sometimes in the same way with people who haven't had anything bad happen to them, because I
Yeah.
did see this happen with one of my aunts where her life was sad. It's the first time something kind of bad happened to her. She was in her, I would say, mid to late 40s. And I mean, she couldn't believe that the whole world didn't stop to focus its attention on her, first of all, but she'd never been through anything. So there are people who, for however life unfolds, have not had, sail through a good portion of life without losing anybody. But but I mean, also, not to take away, you and I are in the same club, and there are a lot of people who have had loss from a young age, or it starts when they're a teenager or in their 20s, or it goes on. And I mean, I don't know what's normal, but those people, man.
Well, and I think, I mean, I totally agree with you in that respect that there are people who I've worked with who get into their 50s and 60s and they said, this is the first death in my family. That takes me back to a couple of things. One, disenfranchised grief are events that happen to us that are grievous in some way, but we don't necessarily validate them. We don't honor them. We don't have the capacity to recognize this as, hey, this is something worth grieving or attending to for our emotional development and maturity and just embodiment of who we are and what human experience is like. But there's also a lot of privilege that goes along with the life of a person who has never experienced a loss of some type. And I don't mean a death, because plenty of families happen to have everyone intact and there are no deaths, and that's beautiful. But when we think about the way that society is structured around people who've never experienced a loss of some kind, who is protecting them? Who is keeping them insulated against experiencing a life interaction with someone else, right? A friendship breaking up. You've never felt grief over that? Oh my God, you've never had a friendship walk away from you or whatever that is. And I don't think that that's about like optimism or pessimism by any means. I think that there is a lot of insulation in a lot of ways that we minimize our own interactions in the world and don't have capacity to honor, hey, this is technically a loss, right? This could be a place where if you wanted to go down the road of an enriched, a more rich emotional vocabulary, that this would be a place to explore that. I
Mhm.
have those people in my life as well. And they push back at the same thing. When I say everyone's grieving, I'm not grieving. Okay. I'm not going to tell you that you are. That's not my place, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I look at it more from just a perspective of having lost, like, social customs and training in some way. Like, even if you haven't had a loss, there's something that we should have been taught about how to behave from a young age. And I just mention that because I mean, this is going when I started doing my work with grief about 10 years ago and looking into it, I was reminded by a few people, back in the day, there used to be people used to have mourning clothes. Men would wear black armbands. Like there was a signal. You knew that this person had lost somebody and that they weren't going to be okay for a long time. Like they were in this zone where they needed to be accommodated. They needed to be brought the casserole or whatever you would do back
Sure.
then. And
Yeah.
we don't really have that anymore. Um, and so whether people are self-aware about whether they're grieving and what losses they've had and how to relate, there's also not that those social cues are somehow gone, which makes me want to touch on to something you wrote in your book.
Mm.
Humans do not know how to allow others the space they need to grieve, and organized religion is not helping us figure it out. So I did want to touch on that because um, it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing for me anyway. I was raised Catholic, but I'm no longer a practicing Catholic. But I do remember when I was in the heat of grief, you have people who were in the church who were saying things that weren't necessarily useful. And then there were also people saying, well, if you need help, you should go to join your church, go to your church. And I'm like, I actually know that that's not going to work out so well for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
So, and I know that you are an evangelical. Yes.
I
Yes.
used to be. I
Used to be.
definitely I was raised Protestant in a Lutheran church. And then when I got to college, I joined a handful of different evangelical churches and became a worship leader actively um, until about 2018.
Hmm. So, what was your experience in the context of that
Yeah.
in when with your grief?
Yeah. The capacity for evangelicalism to understand lament and ongoing experiences and expressions of loss is really muted by an aggressive messaging of but God. but God can do all things, but God will be present, but God is sovereign, but God is in control, but God has, add any scripture ripped out of its context that you want and slap it over the top. And I have attended so many funerals in the last decade that were in evangelical churches where I would find myself arms folded, legs crossed, head down,
Mm,
so frustrated with the minimizing and the spiritual bypassing that was happening from the leadership, from the speakers, not allowing people to stay present with themselves as they're grieving, trying to move very quickly into celebration, into healing. I mean, for the love, we call them celebrations of life. And while that can be true and cathartic and healing, we're not looking for catharsis in our grief expression. We're looking for transformation. We're looking for integration. We're looking for a way to be allowed to keep this grief present and to expand around it instead of making it really small and not that hard and really okay. And I have friends and family who have told me, I grieved before I knew God, and now I'm grieving something else after knowing God. And I don't understand how I did it on the front end. And I said, well, you did it in a way that made sense to you then. And now what's different? Well, I now know the word of God, so I can take that and apply it to my situation. And I'm like, sure, but your behavior is the same as it was before you grieved anything in the first place. Like, you're still lashing out at people. You're short tempered. You're agitated. You're fueling your body with junk food. I would argue that you're actually not nourishing anything. You're not allowing anything to heal. You're minimizing it. You are talking over it instead of talking with it. And there are some incredibly healthy ways within faith practices to integrate our grief and to show up with ourselves and allow our faith practices to speak into those spaces. But from my experience, the majority of people do not have capacity to do that for more than a week, for more than a month. And when I stepped down from leading and really needed time to just exist before I officially said I'm done leading worship, it was maybe a couple of months before someone's like, aren't you feeling better? Why aren't you coming back? We need you. Oh, you don't need me. You need my labor. And me is not available. Me is a mess. Okay.
mhm.
Me needs compassion and understanding and companionship. And that for me is the part when someone says, go find your church community, get support from them. They're asking you to say, I don't have capacity for companionship, but they might. Isn't that the whole point of the church? And yeah, it really is, but we're not equipped to do it. We don't have instructions, we don't have guidance, we don't have classes to do it because we're so busy saying evangelical or everlasting life is coming. Don't worry. Make sure you align your behaviors so that you don't grieve the Holy Spirit. This is what's necessary. And it's just, it's so empty to me. That is an dishonest process. It is not the full expression of humanity to me. So I can see people who are perfectly comfortable with spiritual bypassing as their product of grief work and how they move through it. And again, it's not my job to tell you how to grieve. It's my job to make space for you to learn what grief means to you. And if that's all it means, that's fine.
One of the things though that I try to get across when I'm speaking about grief though is there really is no bypassing. I mean, as you're saying, you had contact with people who were saying, hey, I'm fine. I've got it in the context of my spiritual beliefs in God, but you could see they were still angry. You could see they were still unhappy because there is that part of grief, or it is grief. It's a physiological process.
Yep.
There's no short circuiting the stages of it.
Yeah.
You will go through all the various things of your identity being torn upside down, secondary losses,
Yeah.
the shock. You can have shock as I mean, my sister was ill for a while. She died. I was still in shock 10 months later, knowing that it was coming. So there's
Yep.
the shock sometimes when something's not anticipated, but you can still have shock. And I know your mom had a short illness, and I'm sure you were still there a year later or many months later, at least just trying to get your body, your mind to accept your new reality. Like you're
Yep.
disjointed that way. And there's no short circuiting those things. So that's why I'm just, in reading your book, one of the things that that just struck me is that we're so tribal about so many things in our country, in our society. We're tribal about sports, we're tribal about politics, we can be tribal about religion, but we're not really tribal about grief. And that's one of the places where having a tribal structure would actually help a lot of people, because in those situations, you have rituals and you have like a really strong base of support. But I did want to share just a little story with you, Mandy, too, just to, you were saying how they wanted you to come back to church and do your leadership right away. I had made a film, and there was a man who told me that he basically ended a friendship with a guy he had known from his childhood, because after his wife died, 6 weeks after his wife died, who he nursed through an illness, who he was desperately in love with, his friend said to him, "You're still grieving this? Get over it, man." Like 6 weeks. So this is a thing that unfortunately happens
often.
And people don't, like I said, they don't seem to understand that this is when it's the way we love people and our identities are made from our relationships and how we are in this world. When these losses happen, that all goes out the window, and it's painful, and it takes a long time to figure out who you are again.
Yeah.
And
this is one of the reasons I actually love validating pet loss. When we look at the way a pet creates attunement with us, when we say physiologically, grief is impacting our nervous system in the same way that anything impacts our nervous system. It's a stimulus, and it needs to be processed and metabolized, lest we store it for a later date when we then forget how to recognize it. Pets are unconditional sources of love. Pets are companions that are constant. Pets come into our lives when we are, young adults, and then we get married and we have this pet, this cat or dog we've had forever, or any other pet. But specifically, cats and dogs can attune their nervous system with a human nervous system. And so when that pet is gone, there is a hollow feeling in so many areas. It's the same loss we experience when we lack that care, that space, that consistency that a relationship offers. And so, it's the same with a friend. This is why it's so hard when people put grief losses in a hierarchy. The way we interpret and are defined by or understand ourselves through a relationship, that's everything. And my relationship to you is going to be different than my relationship to my kid and to my friend and to my husband and to my family. And yet I would still be moved. I say still, so carefully. I don't love that word anyway, but I would be moved to hear of a loss in my life of someone who is not an immediate person, because my relationship to them is still important. I still see them as valuable, and I still want wholeness for them. And being able to establish a community. This is one thing I love about Francis Weller's work, is his is a very somatic and spiritual approach to who we are as people and how we need one another to create ritual and to create space for lament that is communally honored and also grounded in the reality of what life really is, and how that ritual and those connections change us for the better. We are always redefining who we are, and that the belief that I'm not grieving, or I'm fine, or to your point, that I can pretend that bypassing is a real thing, even though it's just storing it up for later. Unwinding those beliefs is part of grief work, and it's part that takes a long time, that can be exhausting, but it's also done so much more efficiently, is a weird word to use, but it's true. We do our grief work so much more efficiently in the reflection of others, when they are with us, when they can mirror back to us, and when they can just be uncomfortable with us and build their own distress tolerance while helping me navigate mine.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that people are more sympathetic when someone loses a pet than when they lose a person?
I think sympathetic is a good word for it, because they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Anyway, do you want to get some frozen yogurt? That might make you feel better. That'll cheer you up. The dissonance it takes to jump from point A to point B in that conversation is tough. I think with people addressing a physical or a loss of a person, there's a lot of fear there, right? If they've grieved themselves, they can see things reflected. If they've never grieved themselves, a relationship or a death by themselves, maybe they're afraid it's contagious in some way. Their good vibes are going to be brought down. There's, the phrase toxic positivity rears up because it's really, really scary to think that, oh man, my friend Mandy is grieving and she's not funny anymore, or she's got this dark sense of humor and I can't go there because I don't get it. Um, I really think being able to introduce the concept of tragic optimism, this idea that I can both and through life. There will be both wonderful things and hard things, and I am a healthier, happier, more whole person on the other side of it. Teaches people, hey, your sympathy is detached from detaches you from your humanity a bit. Like, what would it look like for you to practice maybe some empathy here? Not inserting yourself in my life, but asking, what is that like? Asking a question where I can have some space. Because yeah, I mean, it's like I said, I love talking about pet loss because we write pet loss off left and right. I know if my dog died, she's 4 years old. I've had moments where I've pictured our lives without her, and it sounds horrible, and I can't. I don't
Mhm.
want that because I know when she's gone someday, that's going to be really, really gut wrenching for everyone in my family. She's family too, but
Yeah. Okay. Maybe that's different. I had an experience where I could see on social media, which I'm barely on anymore except for business now, that when someone lost a pet, everyone was really, really
I see
supportive.
what you're
But
saying. Yes.
when
Okay. Got it.
somebody like I lost a person, it was
Hmm.
like,
Radio silence.
yes, and I was just
Yeah.
like, I'm not dismiss. I don't want to. I would not diminish. Sorry,
Yeah.
somebody's pet loss because, as you said, these are the kind of emotional support and connection that animals can give you is very different from people, and it's got that
Yeah.
pure quality in a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And I would not diminish that, but still, when you lose a person, and as in my case, my most recent loss was my sister who had been there longer than any pet we had. And I
Yep.
was expecting to be there for longer. And I just saw that people were much more sympathetic and free to discuss someone's pet loss than a person loss. So I don't
See
know.
what you're
We talk
saying.
about the rainbow bridge for pets way easier than we talk about it for people
Yeah. I
sometimes.
wonder. I wonder if it feels like a safer loss. We know pets are going to have a shorter lifespan than us.
Yeah.
Maybe the majority of us have dealt with a pet loss before we've dealt with the death of a person,
Mhm.
perhaps.
Yeah, it
Um,
might also not bring in all the other stuff when people
yeah,
die.
yeah.
Obviously, there's a will and there's their clothes and
So much more
there's
complications.
yeah, and
Yep.
so I don't know if that's I don't know.
I
Or
would think that that plays a lot into it. I mean, I think what you're saying is really insightful. That to me, it feels like a pet loss would feel safer. I'm not going to say the thing that harms someone because I know I'm going to say, oh my gosh, I'm so sad with you that that happened. That's awful. And maybe subconsciously I'm thinking, but it's just a pet. So you're going to move on soon. Or I've experienced pet loss that is really heavy. And then I got a new puppy, right? That same centering mentality of, well, this is what I experienced in loss. So I'm going to casually or forcefully project it onto your experience in some way, maybe. But I also know, and I will say this for a very, very broad monolithic statement, people on the whole are learning how not to cause more harm to grievers. And so I think part of that trepidation of commenting is I don't want to say the wrong thing, so I'll just say nothing at all.
mm,
In my work, when that feeling rises up, I encourage people to ask some questions instead. Can I, even if the question is, can I ask questions about your person? Would that be helpful? Can I show up and take you to coffee? Would that be helpful? Can I send you dinner? Would that be helpful? Would that be supportive? Right? Asking, what does support look like for you right now with the caveat of don't answer if being quiet feels supportive, right? I think that that's a lot of it. There's a hesitation because there's enough people getting very loud now about how to stop harming people who are actively grieving.
mm. Where do you think that shame fits into it? I thought
Oh,
there's a part where, I think about Brene Brown who cornered the market and
sure.
shame in a way. that there's that part where people don't want to touch you because or you know what I mean? And when I say touch you, I mean like ask that question, even the how are you, like the
Yeah.
real how are you question, because things could be outpouring. And there's
Yeah.
something about the shame of touching that, I think. But
Mm.
I don't really have a good grip on it.
Well, shame says I am bad. I am inherently wrong, right? Guilt is I've done something wrong. Shame is I am wrong. So when we think about shame in the context of someone being a grief supporter, um, for me, that comes into like their own story and their own grief experience. If I'm feeling shame in the way that I am approaching someone in their grief work, I would want to have capacity and safe space enough to reflect back on why that is. Why do I feel like I am inherently wrong or bad in the way that I'm approaching someone else? But I think shame itself, really, in my experience, hits grievers more. Um, I'm grieving wrong. Am I doing this right? Why do I feel anger if I know I'm in the depression state? Those 5 stages of grief really mess with us.
Well, I think
Actively
they're
and aggressively.
outdated now.
Oh,
I mean, I think a lot of
really?
people know that they're outdated now, I
Yes.
hope.
Yeah. Well,
It's
and
not
that
that they're
conversation,
wrong. It's just
yeah,
that we're more complicated than that now. We know that there's more
right.
to it than that. I mean, I want to say hats off. I mean, back then, nobody was talking about anything. So to have a paradigm where it's like, here's at least 5 stages you can
Sure.
work
Yeah.
with was good.
I mean, I think being able to educate people that the original revelation of the 5 stages was through observation of terminally ill folks, figuring out what it looks like to come to a place of acceptance with their own losses. And I talk about it a lot in my own work, saying like our life, our experience with grief is cyclical, not linear. And even then, it's a spiral. We're still expanding as we come around in this cycle that is ongoing. And so I think being able to give some education and some words to that releases shame in a lot of ways. There is no wrong way to grieve. And yet we feel like, well, but getting trashed every night, why do you keep telling me that's not good? That's not right. What's the harm reduction approach then? Because there is no wrong way. And if you want to bypass your pain by getting drunk, that's one approach. Is it lasting? Is it helpful? Does it bring you into a place of wholeness and openness to integration and healing work? Or does it numb you and push you further away from that person you want to become? Right? That's the hardest part about grief work is it's never one thing. It's never a worksheet or a book and then you move on. It is
Mm-hmm.
every single step forward is a Pandora's box of the different areas you can explore. And that's why I think it's so crucial that we have conversations about it because like I still stand on it. We all have grief we could be grieving or actively pursuing learning something from. I just also know that sucks a lot. It's really hard to do. And staying in that active state of grief is not something even I want to do. I take a lot of time back to say like, "Oh, I acknowledge that this is a nervous system response. Something wants attention right now, but I'm in the middle of a field trip with a bunch of 4th graders and that's not the right time. So I'm going to, set this aside and be present and um, but not feel shame for needing to set something aside, not feel like I've done something wrong, um, or that I am inherently bad at what I do because I don't want to be really, really present with a bunch of 4th graders
Mm-hmm.
and my grief. So,
I did want to ask you some questions specific to parent loss.
sure.
Did you have the experience of feeling like you were an adult orphan, which is not uncommon?
I did. Yeah. I have thought that many times. I also on other days push back and say, I have a mother. She's just not on this earth. I have a mother. That's not a weird thing to think and hold on to. But the sensation of being orphaned, partially orphaned in the world is incredibly visceral. And it also led me into a deeper exploration of compassion for people who have been orphaned at any age, and certainly as an adult. And with a young baby, I remember thinking, like, gosh, even until now, I wish I could call my mom just to bounce something off, even if I didn't want the advice or didn't hear about it as a parent. Like, this is terrible being a parent without access to a mom to ask questions of. But Yeah, that adult orphan experience is not, I don't own that for myself. I don't identify as an orphan. Obviously, I have my father too still, but
Mhm.
even if I didn't, I don't know that I would. I think for me, it just reminded me very holistically, wow, no adults know what they're doing. If I'm 40 now and I'm questioning what I'm doing, everyone is faking it. Okay. Okay. That takes the pressure off. I am doing the
Mhm.
best I can. I'm going to continue doing that and not put anyone on a pedestal as like, wow, they've figured it out.
Yeah. I just think it's difficult. I've known a few people. I've only lost one of my parents, but the difficulty of wanting to be or needing to be comforted by the very person. Like, you would go to them for comfort and
Yep.
that's the very person you lost. It really
Yeah.
strikes a certain spot.
Yeah.
Um, you know, Mandy, I am going to move to what I call my lightning round of questions. It's the
Hit
questions
it.
I ask all my guests. They're broad ranging questions. Um, so what does a well-lived life look like to you?
One that I can look back on and not feel, again, any shame about, that I am happy to share any story about, that I'm happy to uh, leave behind. One that I can say I was joyful and I was full and I was laughing all the time and I was loud and I was full of life. I would be fine getting to that point. There's um, Alua Arthur is a death doula, and her book, Briefly Perfectly Human, is beautiful. And that's part of something she talks about too, is that I want to die after living a long life that I'm happy to leave behind.
That's lovely. How do you think that people should take care to be connected to their soul or spirit?
Hmm. In my work, we approach grief from a heart, mind, body, spirit approach. So, where I come at it from is through a lens of our core values, what matters the most to us, which can change day to day, month to month, year to year, um, and allowing those values to be the lens through which we approach our sense of connection to ourselves and our inner world, to the people we are in immediate connection with, to our community, and to our sense of spirituality, if we have one. I think that that approach has to be integrative, consistently curious, and willing to evolve. Because again, no matter what we're taking in, the idea is we are expanding around the thing that we take in and creating capacity to withhold that new space that we've created within ourselves. And I think that spirituality and our souls, and however you want to, whichever word resonates the most, that energy remains with us. And when it is not tended to, it dissipates.
What do you suspect is the true nature of reality?
Oh, I have no concept of that. I just constantly say, time is a construct. This is all made up. We're all doing our best. I'm just going to go put some, my feet in the grass and pretend that the world makes sense and that there are no alternative universes. My husband's a huge comic book fan as well. And so when I think about reality, I constantly wonder, are there alternative versions of me out there? Are there places where maybe I'm very, very, very tall and I don't exist in America? Maybe I live in, who knows, Norway. I have no pretense that I understand reality
Mm.
whatsoever.
It's funny. I was having a conversation with somebody. This is a couple months ago, and when I'm having a bad day or I'm not feeling great, I hate to think that I'm sort of screwing up or having pain across multiple dimensions of space and time. It's like I don't want more of this here. Is this going on?
Please tell me there's a version of me in the universe that is smarter than to do that one over and over. That one keeps hurting. Yeah.
Now, when you die, as I'm laughing, I'm asking a serious question. When you die, assuming the consciousness or your soul survives, what do you hope to learn or discover?
Hmm. Like, what questions would I ask if I'm knocking on the gates?
Or you're in the gates and it's like, what do you think? What would you want to have going on in there?
Hmm. funny, as a grief educator person, I've never really spent a whole lot of time thinking about that so much. Um, hmm, I think I would want to start. I just think I would want to see colors that I know I can't see.
Mm.
What are the
Mhm.
limitations I have in this body? I'm only using 10% of my brain. Well, 4% of my brain, 1%. Okay. Quick, download the other 94%. give me give me some access. When I was a kid, I used to really love the story of King Solomon in the Bible when he talked about the mothers debating who was the parent of this baby. And there was that one mom says the baby is mine, and the other mom says it's mine. And he says, fine, chop the baby in half and give each part of the baby. And the true mother says, holy God, no. Okay, it's hers. It's
Mhm.
fine. And of course, I remember reading that when I was young and saying, I want that wisdom. That wisdom seems so simple, but I want it. That's what I want, is to know how to think about a thing in a way that creates wholeness and truth for others as well. So I just want to, and I want to know what colors those mantis shrimp can see that we can't, because they can see so many colors.
A lot of, or many near-death experiencers have said that they see colors that we cannot perceive here. That it's that
Oh,
some of them,
perfect.
some of them have reported, a world of color and of like harmonic sound, like that you
Yeah,
cannot hear here.
perfect.
So,
That's exactly what I want.
maybe Mandy, you got it.
My lips to God's ears, wherever they are.
Also, have you had any what you would feel is after death communication from your mom? A dream or a sense of her presence or anything like that? Have you had any of those?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I call them winks from heaven. I've always called that, just that phrase, because for me, I'm not so worried about trying to communicate with her or trying to determine what happens when we die. But if I am energy, if my cells are vibrating at all given points and energy cannot be destroyed, well, in that point, I'm here somewhere.
Mhm.
They're all here somewhere. I'm not going to pretend I'm smart enough to figure all of that out, but I am going to stay open to whatever that might mean. My husband's best friend died. Oh gosh, it's been 12 years now, quite a while ago. And ladybugs, we see ladybugs everywhere. His family, anytime there's a ladybug, we're like, there he is. It's just a moment where we're saying, this is a wink. This is a reminder. Energy cannot be destroyed. And I think that that's one of those things that we feel really scared to talk about because, well, there's
Not
no,
here, sister, not here. I
yeah,
want to hear
right.
about I want to hear about the winks you had from your mom.
Oh man, so many. We grew up on the ocean in any possible opportunity. On the coast, my grandparents owned a boat when we were younger that they lived on for a while. And anytime I'm at the ocean, I sincerely can feel the presence of my mom on the beach with me, whether she's walking, whether I see something in the waves that reminds me, that brings something back around. It's just these little wings. It's all I can say is it's a reminder of like, yes, and yes, I'm gone and I'm not.
Mhm.
Um, and when I was young, I heard things like that. And it was always, it had a factor of creepy to it because it wasn't ever explained well. It was the heavenly witnesses kind of language where people are watching and cheering you on or whatever, and just feeling like I'm never alone. Can I just be, I don't know, a kid and figure out, or a teenager or whatever. And now I see it as a um more of a like spiritual high five. Like, hey, yeah, good job. Or, ooh, that's okay. High five. You can get up, kid. You can do this. And yeah, those winks from my mom happen when I'm very, very aware of the thin places in life. I think there are times when the world seems thinner. Maybe the veil between worlds or alternate universes, again, who knows, feels a little thinner. And so one of the few things I have of hers is her chef knife. She was a chef. And I will slow down when I'm using it and have a moment that feels like a very sacred, thin place kind of moment.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry to hear that some of your I guess your earlier religious upbringing had you feel that that kind of stuff would have you more under surveillance, like the
Yeah.
spirits are surveilling you. Who wants that?
so much big brother language that comes in around man. And it was really reinforced as I got older with the advent of, what is it, Elf on a Shelf?
Oh,
That
yes.
idea of like
I'm a little older,
authoritarianism.
so thank God I missed
I'm
that.
so grateful I never gave into it. The pressure was so strong to be an Elf on a Shelf mom. And even as a young married person before we had our daughter, this idea of like, isn't that fun and quirky? No, it's embodying authoritarianism. I'm not interested. And performance-based spirituality. Can we actually have a conversation about why you like that? Because I don't know that you are seeing the full picture. Anyway, yeah, nope, not a fan.
Yeah, that is a little sinister thing that's wrapped in this cute little elfin package. Sinister idea. Anyway, Mandy, where can people find you and the good work that you are doing?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm at mandicapehart.com. So it's CAPEHART. And my website has access to the podcast, my book, The Grief Project on Facebook is a free group, the private one I talked about earlier. One-on-one coaching access is there. And I'm on social media at Mandy Capehart as well.
Okay. And finally, any messages you want to impart to the listening audience?
I would say continue being courageous and asking questions to stay curious about what you're experiencing. And instead of looking for why you're experiencing it, maybe question, how can I experience this differently? Because that's where growth and authenticity come from.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thanks
so much
having
for
me.
being on today. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks for watching. Click to join us on another journey and don't forget to subscribe.